Alright, so I've been gone for a while, but I am going to restart this series. I've also been considering redoing a few of the older videos in the series because looking back on them, I am not satisfied with their quality. But I'll leave that up to you guys in the comments. The Spookhorn history for this video will be on Bleeding Kansas. The presidential election of 1852 was held on November 2nd, 1852. There were 296 electors and 149 electoral votes needed to win. Incumbent Whig President Millard Fillmore sought a term in his own right. He was backed by the Southern pro-slavery faction of the Whig Party. However, Fillmore was opposed by the Northern anti-slavery faction of the party due to his signing of the Compromise of 1850, which contained the Fugitive Slave Act. These Northern Whigs instead favored Commanding General of the U.S. Army Winfield Scott of New Jersey for the presidency. Fillmore's Secretary of State Daniel Webster of Massachusetts also ran for the nomination, announcing his candidacy in 1851. Webster mainly had the backing of New England delegates. The Whig National Convention was held from June 17th to June 20th, 1852 at the Maryland Institute College of Art in Baltimore, Maryland. 296 delegates were in attendance. 149 votes were needed to be nominated. Fillmore peaked at 133 delegates on the first ballot. Webster peaked at 32 delegates on the 41st ballot. Finally, on the 53rd ballot, Scott was nominated with the support of 159 delegates. The candidates for the vice presidential nomination were Secretary of the Navy William Alexander Graham of North Carolina, Senator James Pierce of Maryland, Senator John Bell of Tennessee, Congressman Edward Stanley of North Carolina, Governor of Florida Thomas Brown, former Missouri State Representative Edward Bates, former South Carolina State Representative James L. Pettigrew, and former Attorney General for Tennessee's 9th District John Wesley Crockett. Although Bates led on the first ballot, Graham was nominated on the second. A month earlier, the Democrats held their convention at the same location. Their candidates were former Secretary of State James Buchanan of Pennsylvania, former Secretary of War William L. Marcy of New York, Senator Lewis Cass of Michigan, Senator Sam Houston of Texas, Senator Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois, Senator Henry Dodge of Wisconsin, former Congressman William Orlando Butler of Kentucky, and House Delegate Joseph Lane of Oregon. However, when it came to voting, the convention was deadlocked. Delegates from Virginia decided to move their support to a doughface, or a northern politician who appealed to Southerners. The two doughface candidates brought up were former Senator Franklin Pierce of New Hampshire and former Congressman Henry C. Murphy of New York. Ultimately, the Virginia delegation decided to support Pierce. Pierce's support began to grow, and he was nominated on the 49th ballot. The Democratic vice presidential candidates were Senator William R. King of Alabama, former Senator Robert Strange of North Carolina, Senator David Rice Atchison of Missouri, Senator Solomon W. Downs of Louisiana, Senator John B. Weller of California, and Major General Gideon Johnson Pillow of Tennessee. King was nominated on the second ballot. The Free Soil Party was still active during this election and was the strongest third party in the nation at the time, holding 3 Senate seats in Ohio, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire. However, many of their former members, including the party's 1848 nominee and former president Martin Van Buren, had left the party to rejoin their previous political parties. The Free Soil Convention was held at the Masonic Hall in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. There, the party nominated Senator John P. Hale of New Hampshire for president with the support of 192 delegates. For vice president, they nominated former Congressman George Washington Julian of Indiana. In the South, the Union Party emerged as an offshoot of the Whig Party by Southern Whigs, dissatisfied with the nomination of Winfield Scott. The Unionists nominated Secretary of State Daniel Webster of Massachusetts for president, and former Attorney General of Georgia Charles J. Jenkins for vice president. The American Party had been founded in 1843 by Louis Charles Levin as a secret society. It was opposed to Catholicism and immigration, believing in a, quote, Romanist plan to subvert American religious liberty. When asked about the group by outsiders, members would reply, "I know nothing." This led to the party being nicknamed the Know Nothing Party. Beyond anti-Catholic and anti-immigration sentiment within the party called for labor rights and opposed slavery. They advocated for government spending, expansion of women's rights, and further regulation of business and industry. They also nominated Webster for president, along with former Congressman George Washington Corbin of Maryland for vice president. In the South, the Southern Rights Party emerged as a pro-secession offshoot of the Democratic Party. The party considered endorsing Pierce, but instead decided to nominate its own candidates. The party nominated former Senator George Troupe of Georgia for president and former Governor of Mississippi John A. Quitman for vice president. The Liberty Party had been greatly weakened by the Free Soil Party becoming the dominant anti-slavery party. However, they nominated abolitionist William Goodell of New York for president and S.M. Bell of Virginia for vice president. Both major parties had similar party platforms. Both Pierce and Scott ran on their military experience. Pierce's slogan was, "We poked you in 44, we shall pierce you in 52. Scott's was, "The hero of many battles." Pierce also ran on the fact that he was a doughface to appeal to Southerners. Democrats attacked Scott due to the fact that his daughter converted to Catholicism and became a nun. On September 27, 1852, Southern rights candidate George Troupe, in a letter he planned to have printed in the New York Times, withdrew from the race and endorsed Pierce, citing his illness as the reason. However, the Southern Rights Party edited the letter to remove the section where Troupe withdrew before its publication in the newspaper on October 16th. On October 24, 1852, just 9 days before the election, Union and Know Nothing nominee, Secretary of State Daniel Webster, died of a cerebral hemorrhage. Many Union state parties removed their slate of electors, but Webster stayed on the ballot in Massachusetts and Georgia. The Know Nothing Party dropped their ticket of Webster in Washington and replaced them with former Deputy Auditor of Pennsylvania Jacob Brum for president and scientist Reynold Coates for vice president. Alright, time for the results. Democrat Franklin Pierce won the election in a landslide, winning 254 electoral votes from the states of Alabama, Arkansas, California, Connecticut, Delaware, Florida, Georgia, Illinois, Indiana, Iowa, Louisiana, Maine, Maryland, Michigan, Mississippi, Missouri, New Hampshire, New Jersey, New York, North Carolina, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, South Carolina, Texas, Virginia, and Wisconsin. Pierce's best state was Texas, where he won 73.1% of the vote. Pierce became the first Democrat to win Connecticut, Rhode Island, and North Carolina since 1836, New Jersey since 1832, and the first Democrat to ever win Florida, Maryland, and Delaware. Pierce won 1,605,943 popular votes, or 50.8% of the popular vote. Whig Winfield Scott came in second place with 42 electoral votes from Kentucky, Massachusetts, Tennessee, and Vermont. Scott's strongest state was Kentucky, where he won 51.4% of the vote. Scott won 1,386,418 popular votes, or 43.9% of the popular vote. Free Soiler John P. Hale came in third with 0 electoral votes. Hale's strongest state was Massachusetts, where he won 22.1% of the vote. Hale won 155,799 popular votes, or 4.9% of the popular vote. Despite the fact that he was deceased and only on the ballot in 2 states, Unionist Daniel Webster came in fourth. Webster's strongest state was Georgia, where he won 8.5% of the vote. Webster won 6,994 popular votes, or 0.2% of the total. Southern rights candidate George Troupe came in 5th. Troupe's strongest state was Alabama, where he won 5% of the vote. Troupe won 2,331 popular votes, or 0.1% of the total. Know-nothing Jacob Broom came in 6th. Broom's strongest state was Pennsylvania, where he won 0.4% of the vote. Broom won 1,836 popular votes, or 0.06% of the total. Close states, or states with margins under 10%, were Michigan, which voted for Pierce by a margin of 9.62%, Indiana, which voted for Pierce by a margin of 7.88%, New Jersey, which voted for Pierce by a margin of 6.91%, Maryland, which voted for Pierce by a margin of 6.59%, Rhode Island, which voted for Pierce by a margin of 6.52%, Massachusetts, which voted for Scott by a margin of 6.38%, California, which voted for Pierce by a margin of 6.19%, Iowa, which voted for Pierce by a margin of 5.39%, New York, which voted for Pierce by a margin of 5.21%, Pennsylvania, which voted for Pierce by a margin of 5.02%, Ohio, which voted for Pierce by a margin of 4.65%, Connecticut, which voted for Pierce by a margin of 4.23%, Louisiana, which voted for Pierce by a margin of 3.88%, Kentucky, which voted for Scott by a margin of 3.12%, Tennessee, which voted for Scott by a margin of 1.46%, North Carolina, which voted for Pierce by a margin of 0.9%, and Delaware, which voted for Pierce by a margin of 0.19%, or just 25 votes. This was the last election where the Whig Party would come in at least second place. Alright, time for Sweet Corn history. In 1854, Senator Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois introduced the KansasNebraska Act in the U.S. Senate. The bill would organize the territories of Kansas and Nebraska in previously unorganized U.S. territories with the intention of building a transcontinental railroad across the Great Plains. To appease Southern legislators, Douglas included a provision in the bill to allow residents of the territories to vote on whether to allow slavery. Therefore, the KansasNebraska Act would make the Missouri Compromise of 1820 obsolete, as both Kansas and Nebraska were above latitude 3630. According to the Missouri Compromise, slavery was to be outlawed north of this line. The bill passed in the Senate by a vote of 37 to 14 and narrowly passed in the House by a vote of 113 to 100. 8 days after it passed, it was signed into law by President Franklin Pierce. Little trouble was caused in Nebraska, where Nebraskans cared little for slavery and voted to outlaw it. However, in Kansas, pro-slavery Missourians, known as border ruffians, poured into the territory and used voter fraud to win early elections. In an election for a non-voting delegate to represent the territory in Congress, more fraudulent votes were cast than legal votes, leading to pro-slavery Democrat John Wilkins Whitfield being elected, although Congress would declare the election invalid and the seat vacant. Meanwhile, to counter the border ruffians, abolitionists from New England, led by a man named John Brown, and known as Free Staters, entered the territory. In March of 1855, the territory held its first election for territorial legislature. Whether a pro-slavery or anti-slavery legislature would be voted in would determine whether Kansas would be free or slave. Around 4,000 armed Missourians entered the territory to vote. As a result, 37 of the 39 seats went to pro-slavery delegates, meaning the pro-slavery border ruffians controlled 94.9% of the legislature. Riley County was the only county to elect Free Staters to the legislature. Free Staters correctly alleged fraud. The governor of the territory, Andrew Horatio Reeder, invalidated some of the elections but failed to invalidate a sufficient amount. Therefore, a special election was held to elect legislatures to the 11 empty seats invalidated by Governor Reeder. This time, 8 of the winners of those elections were Free Staters. However, the border ruffians still had an advantage, holding 74.4% of the seats in the legislature. The legislature convened in July, where the border ruffians invalidated the results of the special election and refused to seat the Free Staters elected in them, instead seating the border ruffians elected in the previous fraudulent elections. The legislature legalized slavery and modeled their slave code on Missouri's. Free Staters created their own legislature, created their own constitution for the territory, which outlawed slavery, but did so by preventing African Americans from living in the territory, and elected Charles L. Robinson governor. Pierce believed the Free Staters to be insurrectionists and was dissatisfied with the performance of Governor Reeder, firing him and replacing him with pro-slavery Congressman Wilson Shannon. Due to the opposing governments in Kansas, Congress sent a committee to the territory. The committee declared that the anti-slavery government to be the legitimate government of the territory due to the fraud in the March elections. Things took a violent turn on November 21st, 1855, when border ruffian Franklin Coleman shot and killed Charles Doe, a Free Stater. Although this shooting was not politically motivated and was instead related to a long-running feud between the two, things devolved into chaos when Douglas County Sheriff Samuel J. Jones arrested another Free Stater instead of Coleman. The prisoner was then broken out by a group of fellow Free Staters. As a result, both sides created their own militias. 1856 was an especially violent year for Kansas. The sacking of Lawrence occurred in May when border ruffians attacked and looted the anti-slavery town of Lawrence, which included the destruction of Charles L. Robinson's home. 3 days later, on May 24th, the abolitionist John Brown led a group of fellow abolitionists north of Pottawatomie Creek, where they killed 5 pro-slavery settlers, hacking them to death with broadswords. Brown would face off against pro-slavery forces again during the Battle of Osawatomie, which cemented his reputation as an abolitionist firebrand. Violence would continue in Kansas until 1859. Finally, in 1861, when pro-slavery southern states seceded from the country, Kansas was admitted to the Union as a free state. Alright, thanks so much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed it. See you.